Thanks, Terry. So again, my name is Rudi Wallace. I'm the Vice President of Grants and Community Initiatives at Hamilton Community Foundation. And welcome, Colette. Welcome, Derek. So I have a couple bios here that I'm going to read out. Impressive resumes, so we'll start with you, Derek. So Derek Ballantyne has worked in senior roles in the housing, real estate management, and development business with a particular focus on affordable housing that Terry mentioned. He has managed large public housing portfolios, has extensive experience in complex public and private project environments, fund management, investment management, and social finance in Canada. Derek is currently a managing partner with Newmarket Funds, an innovative impact investment fund manager, principal of DKGI Incorporated, a small housing and finance consultancy, and CEO of Encasa Financial, a responsible investment mutual fund manager. He is currently board chair of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Thanks for joining us, Derek. Colette Murphy is the CEO of Atkinson Foundation. Colette and her team focus on strengthening movements for racial justice, decent work, and a fair economy. For more than 20 years, she has been a leading voice for social and economic justice in Canada's philanthropic sector. Alongside grassroots organizers, policy innovators, and investors, Colette advocates for structural and systemic changes that center equity and build social solidarity. Since joining Atkinson in 2012, she's been out front with several groundbreaking initiatives related to the future of workers, community wealth building, and philanthrojournalism. So thank you both for joining us today. So let's get into it. So we'll start with a big picture one. It's a recent trend for governments developing large infrastructure projects like LRT to focus on community benefits and social procurement policies. Talk about your experiences and or thinking of how this unfolded in Toronto's Eglinton Crosstown LRT, and I'll throw that one to you, Colette.
Hi, everybody. It feels very strange to actually be looking out at a room. It's great to be back in Hamilton. Thank you, Terry, for the invitation. I always love a reason to travel down the 401? No, not the 401. Queensway? What's it called? QEW. There, you can all see I don't get in my car very often, at least not in the last 18 months. So I want to start maybe at a macro level of how community benefits came about in Toronto, and with a specific focus on the Eglinton LRT. And I think the first thing that's really important to understand is that there was a lot of people who were feeling that the economic development model in our city was broken, that it was a zero-sum game where some win at the expense of pretty much everyone. And this group of folks wanted to create a positive-sum game where nobody wins at the expense of anybody else. And so when the Eglinton Crosstown LRT opportunity came about, a group of local residents in affected neighborhoods, community organizations, building trades and other labor unions, workforce development organizations, social enterprises came together and said, how can we seize the opportunity that this 19-kilometer, $5.3 billion project that's going to transect 5 of the lowest income neighborhoods in our city, how can we seize this opportunity to ensure that we're not only building world-class infrastructure on time, on budget, but we're also ensuring that the communities who have historically and persistently are excluded from the benefits of economic development in our city, Indigenous communities, Black communities, racialized people, young people, women, actually can accrue some of the benefits from this development project. And so they came together and formed the Toronto Community Benefits Network. Originally, we were a group of approximately 40 groups along with residents. Today, it is 120 strong. And they worked together to build power to be able to actually have a seat at the table to negotiate. It was called a Community Benefits Declaration. I hope you folks can actually get a Community Benefits Agreement out of it. And would you like me to say a little bit about what was part of the actual agreement?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Please do.
So I'm just going to make sure I have everything. So I think, as folks know, community benefits are legally binding agreements. They traditionally include things like training and job opportunities, potentially affordable housing, social procurement, so small business or social enterprise opportunities, and/or other community benefits. And in the case of the Eglinton LRT with Metrolinx, who you folks also will be working with, the original agreement was 10% of all of the trade and craft hours on the job, so journey persons or apprenticeships, would go to what was then termed historically excluded and equity-seeking communities. The second piece was a commitment to promote what we called professional, administrative, and technical jobs. These are some of the jobs that come into a major infrastructure project before any shovels go in the ground. And people were thinking particularly in terms of, we have many, many highly skilled newcomers in Toronto, drafters, architects, engineers, et cetera, who would have an opportunity to have a pathway into good employment through this process. The third piece that people were looking for were neighborhood improvements, particularly as they related to things like preserving the Kodak building, which was a building that was on one of the main sites where the trains will eventually be serviced. So it was a tough negotiation. It was a negotiation between Crosslinx, Metrolinx, as well as community residents. It's really, really important to understand, in our case, that having a strong community labor partnership and voice was really critical to both increase expectations, like raise expectations that a different kind of economic development model was not only possible, but we could achieve it. And so very quickly, what we've achieved since 2016, there have been 439 hires through the Community Benefits Program. 212 have been for apprentices and journey persons, and these are, career track, really good, strong jobs that may not have otherwise gone to local residents in these communities. 227 placements have gone into professional, administrative, and technical jobs. With Crosslinx, again, jobs that may not have been accessible to local residents otherwise. Over $8 million in purchasing from local businesses in the surrounding area, and $830,000 in social enterprise purchasing. Now, I think the key piece to understand as well is, as a result of that first community benefits experience, we're now seeing them associated with other transit projects in Toronto, with hospital developments, long-term care. We now have a community benefits framework on the books at the city level. So we're moving from, an individual project to an expectation as residents and community members of these things being part of public infrastructure projects, absolutely, and increasingly private sector projects as well.
Thanks, Colette. So just building on that community benefits piece, and in Hamilton, a recent study showed from Oxford Economics that Hamilton's one of the least affordable cities in North America based on median income. And so just thinking about gentrification, thinking about how LRT and these large infrastructure projects are seen as economic drivers, but can also accelerate gentrification. So thinking about community benefits networks as a way of mitigating those factors, what are the levers available to us? And Derek, I'm going to throw this one to your way, just thinking around your role in affordable housing. How could affordable housing be worked into this project as we move forward? Just thinking around, what are the policy and bylaw levers available to municipalities to kind of work with community benefits networks to get that into the agreement, or what other tools and strategies are available?
Sure. So, maybe just to sort of think about these projects, and we always worry about gentrification as a post event from infrastructure investment, but in fact, historically, if you look at infrastructure investment across North America, and I have a good friend in the US who does this professionally, speculation and cost pressure and gentrification starts well ahead of actually any shovel going in the ground. So you got to think about it in perspective, and are there tools and are there ways of intervening well ahead of any sort of activity or any sort of major decisions around spending as you go into these projects. So because I think once a project is announced, you can almost in every project start to see the fundamental element that's going to determine the economics of what you can and can't do in those places, whether it's building or post-project occupancy. You're going to see speculation start, right? In just the nature of the economic system we're in. The work that's been done in Toronto around the Crosstown line has been exceptional in terms of the direct, what I would call the direct community benefits and the impact on individuals. I think we have some lessons to learn about the impact, the unforeseen consequence, or maybe it was foreseen, but the inability to intervene on some of the systems and the economic systems that start to happen along where you get infrastructure coming in. I'll just point to two of them. In Toronto, there was a deliberate choice not to exercise some of the provincial ability to aggregate land into the project so that it could be redeployed in particular ways, in constructive ways about what outcomes you wanted in terms of built form, occupancy, use, and so on along the line. It has been done elsewhere in Ontario, so we'll come back to that, oddly. And then, the impact on small business infrastructure, which, so we all say, well, it's fine. Once the line goes in, everybody gets to reestablish. But by the time they reestablish, the rent scale, the rent systems, the property values, everything else has shifted, and you get a real displacement. The potential for displacement, you can already see it in a couple of neighborhoods, displacement of small enterprise as they get knocked out of these places. So you ask me, what are the instruments that you can have? I think it starts with this is no offense to any elected official or any bureaucrat, but governments don't do systems thinking well. They're kind of the DNA of these systems is to be siloed and to work in silos because one, it's easier to break a problem up that way, and two, authorities and abilities are segmented within those systems. So it's very hard, and the work that's been done in Toronto is demonstrating you've got to cut across silos, and you've got to get the idea that there's a plan that is going to cut across a number of silos and a number of orders of government's authority. And that only really comes from community. It doesn't, and municipalities, right? Because in the end, municipalities are the level of government on which every evil of other orders of government are visited. It's sort of, you're left to solve the problem. So I think incumbent, and maybe this conversation is part of that, really critical early on to start with a plan that sets out some really clear objectives in different categories. So I think objectives around benefits related to employment, related to access to services, non-displacement of persons in the neighborhood and so on are really critical. But equally critical are what is the, in a sense you have to imagine what the property value landscape looks like after you've done this and what outcomes you would like. Because if you want affordable housing, if you want to maintain small businesses, you cannot do that on really high speculated value of land, underlying land, right? So then the question is, create that plan and create that set of objectives and then start to try and organize behind that, which is really challenging. I completely accept that. In a concrete way, I think oddly, early on, there may be strategic interventions where, you could get community-based groups or others to start intervening along the line in specific ways around specific properties that become linchpin moments in the space of where the LRT is going in. I realize that's complicated, but there are examples of preventing certain urban development outcomes by removing certain pieces of property out of the speculative realm to be able to do that. So how do you do that? You might want to start now thinking about, can we acquire in some sort of consortium fashion 2 or 3 or 4 properties that are really strategic around which you can start to build and leverage other aggregation. The really big public policy instrument that exists is, the right the province has of appropriating land for public purposes when large infrastructure projects go in. It's not a right that has been exercised very frequently, and there's, for a whole lot of reasons, and some very good reasons, a reluctance to use those rights, right? But in Vaughan, on the extension of the line 1, I guess, of the Toronto subway system, we went from naming them by place by naming them by number, so now it's just confusing. But Vaughan wanted to see a city center built, right? And in the purchase of land for the subway stations, Vaughan asked the government to acquire lands around it so that it could be put back for development purposes, but that could be controlled in terms of what was going to be developed and the particular uses that that land was going to be put to. It was ultimately developed by private sector, but it was sort of an interesting and, to my mind, an unexpected place where you would see these kind of powers used, if you want. And those exist, right? So you can, and it's particularly important around stops and around key moments in the way the LRT gets laid out, that you can intervene in that sort of economic landscape and reshape what is going to be delivered ultimately along the way. And in doing that, you control what other public policy objectives you want to see. So if somebody wants to build a significant set of high-rises and you have lands that are going to be available for that purpose and that's what you want, you can also demand a higher rate of inclusion of affordable housing or a different mix of retail and commercial activity than you might have otherwise received just by the natural forces of the market.
Thanks, Derek. Coming back to you, Colette, you mentioned culture change in terms of now Eglinton Crossroads happening, you've trying to get this in other areas. What are some lessons that Hamilton, as we move forward, can take from the experience in Toronto?
Sometimes it's great to be first doing something like this, but sometimes it's really good to be following. And I think there is, because I think there are a lot of lessons. Derek's raised already a couple. First, picking up on the thread of the real impact on small business. We have particular neighborhoods like Little Jamaica, which have been profoundly affected. I think well over 100 businesses have already closed. And if we had the foresight early on, I think people knew it was a huge risk, to Derek's point. But I don't think as a community we necessarily came together and said, okay, what are the alternative forms of aggregating so that perhaps we could build a small business commercial land trust and put some of that land into the commons so that small businesses wouldn't be displaced, and to negotiate that into the process. You have a unique opportunity that we didn't because you're partnering with the city, and in our instance, we weren't in Toronto. Critically important is thinking of those things far in advance before that RFP goes out the door, because otherwise it's really difficult to negotiate with the proponent that's building it after the fact. And so while I don't think pen has gone to paper yet in terms of RFP going out or community being at the table, working with others to imagine what will happen with the speculative land, because it will. The land's already going crazy here. So what can we do around affordable housing? What are the different tools and mechanisms, land trusts, the types of different methods that Derek has talked about? And the great thing is, I think in Hamilton, you have a partner in the Hamilton Community Foundation, amongst others, who have had some really creative ways of working with community to create affordable housing and take some of the pressure out of the speculative market. Critical, secondly, is targets. You absolutely have to have targets. And a lot of times in Toronto, the big debate was, well, we've never done something quite like this before, so nobody wants to say we can get to 10%. We don't know if we can, because there are other systems and structures, as Derek said, that had to come into play in order to be able to make that 10% happen. We needed to rethink how we did workforce development, what that pathway was for people from communities who historically and persistently had been excluded from the building trades. What were the ways that they were going to get into pre-apprenticeship programs, see where those opportunities are, and then to land into the hiring halls. So different systems had to come together, but without a target, you know, any path will do, and you can say, well, 3% is good enough because that's better than 0. So targets are really, really critical, but then also really critical is the ability to monitor and to be accountable, and to be accountable at every step of the way, not only just to play gotcha, but to actually problem solve when the issues do come up. We did have lots of challenges in Toronto related to workforce development. It was a new way of trying to do it where all of the different system partners were coming together, and community-based agencies weren't necessarily in the best position to understand what a building trade specialty, whether it's an iron worker or a carpenter, needed to be able to do the pre-screening so that people would arrive at the site. I'll tell you one very quick story. There was a group of young people, some United Way agencies had gotten them ready to go into a pre-apprenticeship training with the iron workers. And they got there and they realized a lot of these young people were afraid of heights. And now, like, nobody thought to screen, will it be a problem for you climbing up high? Because that's part of what your job's gonna be. So some very basic things we had to work out from a systems at a systemic level as we went along, as we discovered the issues. And the final thing I would say, though, is that the benefit of unlikely partners, both across ministries, across city departments, across communities, with business, with labor, coming together to try and work on these issues, builds the kind of trust and resiliency to be able to deal with other problems as they come up. And so we learned from Eglinton to be able to apply to the Finch LRT. We're learning from the Finch LRT to apply to the hospital developments. And so I guess I'll stop there. See if Derek wants to add anything.
I would only add one thing to that, and this comes from an earlier experience pre-LRT. We, in a large-scale development, redevelopment of a housing community in Toronto, there was sort of an early attempt at community benefits. There was an idea of building into every contract the idea of, you know, if you want a social dividend, which was, for the most part, successful, and it sort of helped identify what we shouldn't do in the future and what didn't work. But one of the key lessons that came out of that was well, there are really two. One was the absolute need, if you want to see a community benefits agreement in place and you want to see these delivered in a way, you have to invest in the capacity of some institution or some set of institutions to actually be able to carry it out. It doesn't just happen miraculously because people get together and meet every once in a while. You know, it takes a lot of research, it takes a lot of time, and that you have to resource that. You have to find a way to do that. And the second one is that you don't get employment and you don't get secondary benefits without a lot of other organizations retooling how they think about training, how they think about working with people. To Colette's example, the community organizations that used to do screening in a certain way suddenly have to do it differently. But in this case, a lot of it rested on the City of Toronto actually rethinking their employment programs and their employment support programs, and they had a lot of difficulty doing that. They couldn't, you know, they couldn't go from an Ontario Works kind of what I would consider sort of a mass processing thing to an individualized, tailored program to get people into positions. You know, and that became one of the challenges in terms of getting the success in those kind of benefit programs, which I think was done much better once the Crosstown piece happened.
And just as a follow-up, how did it get better between the two projects? Like, how did the City of Toronto kind of, like, don't want to get too granular, but how did that take place?
Well, I think first off, the systems players anticipated the issue, but oftentimes, so the city was at the table, the province was at the table, United Way was at the table, TCBN was at the table, the trades, training centers were at the table. You can identify where the problems are, but oftentimes the system itself has to take a while to catch up. And I don't want to pick on the province, but they had a certain way of doing workforce development. And that was at the time the only way they could do workforce development. But what it didn't enable was us to have the expertise of the trades embedded in some of that pre-employment pieces. And so through trial and error, different parts of the system were able to retool. But it is both about the sort of underlying systems recognizing they have to shift it, they have that ambition. So workforce development that is largely paid for by the province has to be able to understand that, well, you know, we used to do it a certain way for this type of a project at scale, right? I mean, I think this is the other piece. If you're trying to do something very boutique-y, well, then you can maybe sometimes do a small-scale program, but we were talking about starting with the LRT and then like picking up all of the both public and private development money that was flowing in to be able to do this at a scale that would actually both meet some of the nervousness of the contractors and their subcontractors who were saying, we have to meet these obligations. Do you actually have the supply? And so I think it is really critical in big projects like the LRT that's going to be happening here in Hamilton to be able to think about it at scale, because then you can begin to apply it. It becomes part of the new breathing of how the system works. It is seamless. You really have all of the different players playing their appropriate role, but it's going to require, like any change management process, everybody having to start to work differently together. And so you need the enabling environment with the money that underpins it. You need the expertise of the different players in the room. And you need to build the confidence and recognition that you're going to try some things and they're not going to work. But if you've built the kind of sort of feedback loops, that you can make the mid-course corrections quickly. Because, like, honestly, you can come down the road to Toronto and find out from many of folks what really didn't work and what the struggles were and what the pain points were related to workforce development, a really fundamental and critical piece, and how it's working better now. And how there are very different players involved. And I guess the other really piece is, like, these kinds of processes, to really do them well, requires everybody to change. Everybody has to change. Everybody can't say, well, this is how we do it. It's like, that might have been how you did it, but if we really want to create opportunities through these kinds of huge infrastructure projects, with our money, it's public money, then and to ensure that communities who have been historically and persistently cut out of the benefits of that economic development, we're just going to have to figure out how to do this differently, because otherwise they would have been getting access to these fantastic trades, jobs, career pathways.
So I want to I know folks are probably writing down their questions, so, we got one coming up. We got two, let's do it. So audience Q&A. So Hamilton has been designed and built for cars and efficiency of movement. Please speak to how, it's the handwriting. Please speak to how to inject the social and economic benefits of placemaking into design along the line and especially at LRT stops?
Do you want to start? Well, I'm not here as an urban design expert or, somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about how you shift a city from a car-based transportation system to a public-based one. But I think, maybe think about three things. One, often, look for examples where this has happened in creating a narrative around the benefits of putting an LRT in. Often you get these sort of instant reactions to these kind of infrastructure investments that just provoke a negative reaction because everybody imagines the worst. And there are now a large number of examples where this has been successfully done. Parts of the Crosstown admittedly are sort of underground, so it's hard to look at that example. And one hesitates to go to Europe necessarily to sort of look for examples because the cities and the city fabrics are quite different. The one that comes to mind for me is Portland, Oregon, who sort of rebuilt a surface transit system, has done it pretty successfully without really disrupting the fabric and in fact enhancing a lot of the fabric that was actually there. Yes, it will disrupt driving patterns and will disrupt street patterns. The good news is they'll be so disrupted before through the construction that they may not remember by the time the thing is finished what it used to be like to be able to drive down these streets in the way they did previously. But I think it's to look and build a narrative early on around what the successes look like and how that can happen. Secondly, I do think it's important to think about the line as not being a linear event, but a series of pieces of fabric that are going to get built, and the stops become absolutely critical. And what happens around those stops and how you think about enhancing the experience at those stops and the land use and where housing goes and so on is absolutely essential. There was a study done, I'm going to say it's maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but that's, might be longer than that, and that's just a function of my unwillingness to accept time passing. In Vancouver around the SkyTrain, because it was a huge piece of infrastructure that went in that was really designed, it was purposefully designed to change the urban fabric along that line. A little bit different because it's not running on the surface, but the same sort of idea of what would happen around stops, how to rebuild infrastructure, what would naturally start to occur. The only problem is there was no accompanying policy or thought to actually what might occur in those places, simply that there was an encouragement and zoning changes made in Vancouver to allow higher density. Study revealed about 5 years ago that in fact is exactly what happened. Densities have increased around SkyTrain nodes by about 70%. You can see all sorts of activity. Only two things happened that were not really, you might in retrospect have anticipated, but were not anticipated at this time. First one is there's been a tremendous displacement of low-income families away from the SkyTrain. So this public transit is used by lower-income households. They tend to use transit more than higher income, and Vancouver is no exception. But the very people who this was designed to serve have now been displaced away from the line because the value of being along the SkyTrain was kind of baked into Vancouver pricing in a way that was unexpected. So you're seeing the displacement of a lot of lower income families. And the people living along the line are the lowest percentage users of the line. So it's a bit ironic that people are now, the users of SkyTrain are still required to take buses before they actually get on that piece of infrastructure. So I do think it's to anticipate what that is and think about what has to be built and why it would be important to try and develop, sort of back to our earlier conversation, plans that around these stops, around these places, you really think have some foresight about what might happen as the development takes place.
And so just, again, coming back to your point around trying to secure some land around those spaces, et cetera. So can you expand on trying to, how to acquire those 2 to 3 properties along the line to secure that affordable housing for those low-income folks who could benefit greatly from access and use transit versus, speculative land, developers come in, in Vancouver and Victoria, high-rise condos in Toronto, and then folks can't live there. So how do we secure 2 to 3 more properties for affordable housing along the line?
So I'm not going to suggest this is an easy thing to do, but having had some experience when I was with Build Toronto around dealing with transit operators and trying to get them to understand how stops and lines can be used strategically for other purposes than moving people in a linear fashion, it's not simple because transit programs are by and large driven by engineering. And the engineers are preeminent, and the decisions around line are always seem always to be driven by what the engineers want, turning radiuses, this and that. And I think, the point starts with having a bigger conception of what the LRT is. This is not just about 2 tracks or 4 tracks in the ground and stops. It's about rebuilding a piece of fabric in the city. And what it will take to do that is, in fact, the acquisition of more than just the land or occupancy or rights of way on the land that exists under those tracks, but strategically in other places along. So I think it's to build political and public support for the idea that this is not just about a set of tracks. The project is about a much bigger piece of the fabric. And in some ways, I know the narrative is always to try and minimize the impact of these projects and say, really we're just, when it's all done, done, all you're going to have is some tracks and some streetcars running or some train cars running, and nothing else will change. But in fact, I think it might be more useful to build a narrative that says there will be significant change, and this is what we could reimagine that part of the city to look like. And I think, and start to build the political support for using some of the powers that governments have to actually reorganize space.
Can I just build on that? Because I do think that this has to be a story about how we're building a more inclusive Hamilton. And an LRT is an opportunity to spur that, but an LRT in and of itself, of course, is not enough. It's what are the benefits that communities could rightfully begin to imagine as a result of it. And because an inclusive economy should lift all boats, but in order for those opportunities to happen, there has to be real democratic participation as part of that process. And this is where creating that pressure, the counter pressure outside, and supporting communities to bring their visions, their ambitions, their aspirations for what this could do for them, but for the city, I think is really critical. And starting to build out a narrative that we all do better when we all do better. And that this particular infrastructure could be the beginning of an opportunity to experiment so much more around different forms of affordable housing, the way we can put capital together, that's government, private foundation, community, the way we can think about different forms of business, affordable community business spaces. I think that we have to tell that bigger story. We have to hold that as a bigger story and tell ourselves that. And we also have to, through the kind of work that Carl, your group, the Center for Civic Engagement here in town is doing, to also build that power when people say it's really tough and there's these other competing interests and we can't do it. Because often that was the message in Toronto. There was the city's first community benefit in its recent iteration was with around the expansion of a casino. And okay, so not super great, but it was in a part of a community that has faced many economic challenges, and that community had a vision that didn't necessarily want that expansion, but if that expansion was going to come, it had a vision of what it would be, and it was a city proponent negotiation. And one of the things that weren't originally in it was a child care center. They wanted a child care center. That part of the city had very, very underutilized, didn't have a lot of public daycare, regulated daycare was the word I was looking for. And they pushed, and something that was impossible because it wasn't in the original agreement that council had approved came to the fore because the community pushed hard, and the proponents saw that the whole thing could grind to a halt, and they'd have to go back to the table, and council would defer decisions. And so I think real, genuine opportunities for democratic participation from communities, not just consultation, but real democratic participation, and a very strong narrative that says, and speak, we're not building an LRT. We're building, this is an opportunity to use this to build a very different kind of community, one that is, more environmentally sustainable, more economically just, more inclusive, and we're going to create a process that actually demonstrates it and gets the wind in the sails to do the difficult things like try to get parcels of land acquired that can be taken out of the speculative market.
So we're talking about democratic action. We're talking about, I'm assuming, advocacy. We're talking about going to council and trying to convince, cajole, cooperate to include community benefits agreements or include this different way of thinking. Is that correct? Is that kind of just a summary?
Well, I think from the start you want to imagine building a different table. So people aren't sitting on the outside sort of banging and saying, hey, we have a stake in this. It's about understanding that the quality of development, it's that we can achieve, the vision for our communities will be so much stronger, better, more resilient, we'll move quicker, we won't have as much resistance at each stage if people are genuinely at the table at the front end. And of course the ambition is that you don't do these as one-off. We're already seeing provincial governments integrating community benefit expectations into economic development projects. That's the same federally. In Toronto, the City of Toronto built a social procurement framework and a community benefits framework so that we're not having to reinvent this every time. And you will still need that community, and community labor in our instance was really critical, seeing that real partnership, because one of the things, when people ask why did the Atkinson Foundation get into this in the first place, one of the things we talked about, there's $500 billion in this country in development money on the table. How can we not think about this kind of money being used and deployed in ways that maximize environmental, social, economic, and community benefit? But the other reason is necessity is the mother of invention. We're going to have huge demographic pressures on our workforce. Already, I think in Q2 this year, they talked about, 62,000 shortage of workers in the construction industry. They're projecting, over 300,000 by 2029. And we know that we're going to see that in other industries. We need all hands on deck. We need everybody being able to contribute to their full potential, but also to be able to benefit from the wealth that's being generated in our communities.
Awesome, thank you all. I'm getting the signal for time, so I will pass it to Terry to, no, go ahead.
Why don't we just allow a minute or two to wrap up?
Perfect. That sounds great. So with that, any final comments from you, Derek, you, Colette?
No, Colette, maybe one final thought. Colette, mention the word capital, which I think is ultimately always going to be at the core of this conversation. Right? So I do think in going forward and thinking about this, it's also important to think about how does this become, what are the economics of this in sort of the macro sense, and how to make this in a way affordable, and what are the instruments that are going to be required to be able to do that. So how to deploy capital, how to raise it, and what's the return going to look like, both to those who are going to put the capital up, to governments, and to others. So I do think having big ideas also means you should have a decent financial plan to back them up.
Thanks. Colette, any final thoughts?
I guess the final thing maybe I would say is that this is a chance to demonstrate that trust can be rebuilt, relationships can be remade, and an inclusive economy is possible. And so I just think, you know, it has been a challenge in Hamilton, as I understand, to get to this place. Really look forward to seeing what we can learn from you as you move forward in the next stages, and welcome the opportunity to continue to travel alongside with the foundation, with the Community Benefits Network, and others who are trying to imagine how we deploy capital in ways that all of us can share in the benefits from.